Hello historians, and welcome to another Purple Shirt History. In this video, we'll talk about the origins of the American Civil War, 1820 to 1861. I will be doing a video series on APUS history in the future, but this is the first time you're going to see me do content on American history, so I hope you really enjoy it and learn a lot. This topic covers a lot of ground: westward expansion, industrialization, but the key thing is the North-South divide over slavery, which will eventually lead to the Civil War. Please just take a second to like and subscribe so other students can find this video in this gigantic sea of content that is YouTube. Thank you very much. Now, sit back, relax, grab your notebook, and let's learn about the path to civil war in America during the 19th century.
So here's today's agenda. First thing, how was the issue of slavery addressed between 1820 and 1850? The slavery issue was always a problem in the formation of America, going back to the Constitution. So between 1820 and 1850, things really took a turn for the worst in terms of the relations between the states and how they dealt with slavery. So we're going to see some attempted compromises, which will all fall apart. And this is also going hand in hand with westward expansion. When new states enter the Union, the key question was, were they going to be a free state or a slave state? And the balance of free and slave states was a big issue, especially with Texas and California. We'll talk about that. But there had to be a balance. There couldn't be more slave states than free states, in the Northerners' opinion. And the Southerners were worried about the amount of free states being created with westward expansion. How and why did sectional divisions widen between 1850 and 1856? Of course, the Compromise of 1850 is a big ticket item. You need to know, like I said, the balance between the free and slave states, and popular sovereignty, meaning the states could vote whether they wanted to be a slave state or a free state. This smashed a previous compromise called the Missouri Compromise, where there was a set line of longitude that said anything below this can be a slave state and anything above this cannot be a slave state. So that was the first big thing that happened in the 1850s. The Fugitive Slave Act and the Supreme Court. This is the one that sticks in my mind the most. I even remember the Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice was named Roger Tierney. And it was so pro-slavery. Not only did it really side with the slave owners, it said any slave that went to the North and was able to go to a free state and gain their freedom was legally obliged to be thrown back into slavery. These decisions made the abolitionists in the North go crazy, and we see a sharpening of tensions in the country. There was a book by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe called Uncle Tom's Cabin. I remember having to read portions of this book in grade school. It was a sensation at the time. It really made people in the North much more anti-slavery, to the extent that Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe and said, "Oh, so you're the woman that caused," something along the lines of, "You're the woman that caused this great war." It was pretty intense, Lincoln saying something like that. But it was a huge deal, this novel about slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, Lincoln Douglas debates, Senator Stephen Douglas, he was the one talking about this one and enforcing popular sovereignty. This will lead to Bleeding Kansas. Speaking of Lincoln, the Republican Party, it was originally founded as a abolitionist party and a mixture of Whigs, Democrats, Free Soilers, which were, a farmers kind of party. Last but not least, there was an actual almost murder in the Senate. A man named Charles Sumner was from Massachusetts. He was an abolitionist, and he started railing against slavery and Southern senators, and he almost gets beaten to death on the floor of the Senate. So almost a murder on the Senate floor. Sumner was almost beaten to death with a cane. This is another thing that was showing how tight the tension was in the 1850s. Why did the Republicans win the 1860 presidential election? Why did Abraham Lincoln become president? First thing, there is a very divided electoral map. The Democrats could not settle on one unified candidate. So Stephen Douglas was the Northern Democratic candidate, and a guy named John Breckinridge was the Southern Democratic candidate. So obviously they split the vote of the Democrats. And there was another man, John Bell, who ran in a party called the Constitutional Union Party. and he also siphoned off votes, leading Lincoln to win. Lincoln did not win a single Southern state. He wasn't on the ballot in many states. So South Carolina will be the first to succeed after Lincoln wins. Lastly, why did the Civil War begin in April 1861 with the bombing of Fort Sumter? We see all the attempts to kind of preserve the Union fall apart. People are starting to pick sides. People are deciding whether to stay with the Union or to join the Confederacy. There will be slave states that do not join the Confederacy. That is critically important. So places like Kentucky, Maryland, border states. So not every slave state joins the Confederacy. That's very critical to know. And Lincoln was very keen to keep those states out of the Confederacy because it was a massive amount of economic and manpower that would have been available had every slave state joined the Confederacy. So the final moments from the election of 1860 to the starting of the war in 1861, we see the battle lines being drawn. People like Robert E. Lee deciding to join the Confederacy and break his oath to the United States of America. Between 1820 and 1850, we see the disagreements about the political system and the rights of slaves, which has always been a problem since the foundation of America. Looking back at the founding fathers, we see most of them were Virginia plantation owners. Just George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are the two best-known examples. But these men owned lots of slaves, and it was a contentious issue for them. They didn't want to free their slaves, and this never got resolved in the period from the founding of the country to the run-up, which we're talking about now, to the Civil War. So as the U.S. was pushing westward, so we see in that little map there, the Arkansas Territory, the Missouri Compromise Line, 3630. So that said, anything above that cannot be slave territory. With popular sovereignty, though, we're going to see in Kansas that this is going to be a huge problem. Impact of territorial expansion. I'm going to do another Gigantor video just on westward expansion because that in and of itself is another half-hour video. Texas, just how Texas became a state, that's probably going to be another gigantic video. California, how it became a state. So I'm not going to get too deep into it. Just know the westward expansion played a critical role in this slavery issue, free state, slave state. Impact of population growth and movement. America is an exploding country. GDP, population, influence, everything. It is a country on the upswing. Another aspect that really needs to be looked upon is the two systems of economics between the North and South. In the North, it's industrial capitalism, just like what happened in Britain. We made a video about that. It is people gathering in factories, mass producing steel, textiles, mining coal, and all that kind of stuff. In the South, it's a slave economy. It's agricultural. It's large plantations for export, cotton, tobacco, these types of things, cash crops. And it is creating an entirely different structure to the industrial capitalism of the North. If you have time, it's a gigantic book, so I don't recommend reading the whole thousands of pages of it, but to get a summary of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, because he writes that book in the 1830s, and he really has an amazing outsider's perspective. He's a Frenchman of what it's like to be in the American North and the American South. And he's really anti-slavery because he sees it's just a worse system. Not saying that the industrial capitalism of the North is paradise or anything like that. It's very brutal in its own right, but it's just much more efficient. Attempts at compromise, including the Missouri Compromise 1820 and the Compromise of 1850. If you're taking the test for Cambridge or AP, make a T-chart of these two compromises, see how they're similar and see how they're different. They're both failures. They're not going to prevent the Civil War. They fall apart. But see what they were trying to accomplish and see the people behind them and what they were thinking and how it could work. Now on to the 1850s. The Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act. Let me talk about the Compromise of 1850 briefly. So this introduces popular sovereignty, meaning the state, when it becomes an applicant to be a member of the Union, will vote as to whether it wants to be a free state or a slave state. For instance, Kansas is set to become a state in the Union. There are people flooding into Kansas who are both pro-slavery and anti-slavery. They set up rival capitals, and eventually they're going to start killing each other. This is a mini civil war called Bleeding Kansas. If you've already studied World War II, this is kind of like the Spanish Civil War. I tell my students it's the dress rehearsal for the bigger conflict. So Bleeding Kansas is what will happen to the entirety of America in the coming years between pro and anti-slavery forces. I stated previously the Fugitive Slave Act was a major win for the Confederacy, and the Northerners hated it. It was such an imbalance in population and economic strength between the North and South. The North was much more economically powerful and populous than the South, but the South seemed to have this political power to such an extent that many people in the North said it was a slaveocracy. So the slaveocracy feeling in the North and in the newspapers of the North that said that the will of the people is being subverted by a conspiracy of slave owners and rich people. Changes in the party political system, the decline of the Whig Party, and the rise of the Republicans. This is a major realignment of American politics, and it's going to eventually settle into the two-party system that we have now of Republicans and Democrats. There were a lot of parties in the middle of the 19th century: Free Soilers, Whigs, Free Whigs, Southern Democrats, Northern Democrats, liberals, you name it, we got it. So there were just so many parties that there had to be some consolidation, and they do kind of coalesce around the Republicans. So this shows the great realignment of American politics. There's a couple of big realignments. For the AP US history videos, I'll do another gigantic video on that one, talking about going back to, the original Federalists and Democratic Republicans and these types of things. But know that the realignment allows the Republicans to become the dominant political force in America in the 1860s and 1870s. Significance of states' rights. This is going to be a legal challenge, essentially. So how much power do individual states have? Are they allowed to secede from the Union? Are they allowed to have slaves? Are they allowed to do this, that, the other? How much power does the federal government have, and how much power does an individual state have? So this balance of power is a key aspect of the political argument going into the Civil War. Why did the Republicans win the 1860 presidential election? The growing strength of abolitionism, and here it says John Brown. You need to know who John Brown is and the attempted slave uprising he tried to create, and his ultimate failure and execution were a martyrdom for the abolitionist cause, and it was a huge step towards the Civil War. People in the South were worried about more John Browns. They were worried about slave uprisings, and it was just another thing that added to the tension. Emerging notion of slave power, e.g. the Dred Scott case. So I mentioned slaveocracy, the disproportionate amount of political power that the South had, the slave states had, over the federal government, despite the economic and population, the demographics of the country. Slave power in the Dred Scott case was seen as it comes to a head. The Dred Scott case was 1857. Dred Scott managed to get to a free state, sued for his freedom, and Roger Tierney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said in this majority ruling, the statement that he made was slaves had no rights. They were property. The exact quote is along the lines of, they have no rights, the white man is beholden to respect. It again inflames the abolitionists, inflames the North, and it is another step towards the Civil War. Increasing confrontation within and between the North and South. We mentioned Bleeding Kansas, so we already have a war going on, more or less. We already mentioned the Charles Sumner incident, where a Southern senator beats a Northern senator almost to death. We see the press disparaging each other. Very hard to imagine in these days. The press is really vitriolic, and we start to see the contempt that the states have for each other and their practices. The Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. People, do debate, please. I'm begging you to do debate. I don't care what you do, if it's Lincoln-Douglas, if it's public forum debate, if it's oratory, if it's parliamentary, if you do Model UN, whatever. Do debate. To me, it's an essential part of your education. You need to learn how to speak to people and speak eloquently and well. So please, I'm begging you, the future generation, please be better speakers than we are. That is my plea for this video. Oh yeah, why was the Lincoln-Douglas debate important? Well, it made Abraham Lincoln a superstar, turned him to the national stage, and he was a frontiersman, a hillbilly, whatever you want to call it. But his amazing speech made it very difficult to dismiss him anymore, and it really impressed a lot of people and put him into national politics. The election campaign of 1860 and the divisions of the Democratic Party, as stated with Douglas and Breckinridge splitting the vote. Why did the Democrats split the vote? Well, obviously it was because of slavery and because of different opinions towards what the policy should be. They couldn't have a unified ticket, they couldn't have a unified candidate, and that led to the split of the Democratic Party. Why did the Civil War begin in April 1861? Reactions to the 1860 presidential election results. Well, April's in spring, so most military campaigns of this era are not started in the wintertime. That's one thing on a practical level. But we stated before, battle lines being drawn, it took a lot of states time to decide what they were going to do. South Carolina was very impetuous. They said, okay, we're leaving. And this led to what the Confederacy was going to look like, what members were going to be in it, how it was going to be structured. So this is why April 1861 was the beginning of the Civil War. Secession of the 7 Deep South states. So when we say the Deep South, we're talking about Alabama, Mississippi, around the Mississippi River, Louisiana. These Deep South states that were heavily in the cotton trade, the core of the Confederacy. This area is where the giant cotton plantations are. This is around the Mississippi River, which is a main artery for the Confederacy to do trade. Having these states in the Confederacy and convincing them to join was critical for this new Confederacy. So what is a Confederacy? It's a looser union. And this is going to hurt the South in the Civil War because they get away from the Union, the federal government of the United States, and they create a confederacy, meaning each state has more individual power. And oftentimes, states in the Confederacy don't want to help the other states. They don't want to leave their home states. So this is a problem for them, the lack of solid structure in the future. And to conduct the war in such a manner was not the best way for Lee and the other Southern leaders. The Battle of Fort Sumter and its impacts. This is a small island off the coast of South Carolina, and it is attacked. It's a federal outpost, and it's attacked by the Confederacy, and this is the official start of the war. There's no debate on this. This is the first shots of the Civil War. The aims of Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. So you need to know, write down that Lincoln, his first job is to save the Union. And he does. It's not at the beginning a war to free the slaves. It's not a moral crusade. It's not about anything other than saving the country and reunifying it. For Jefferson Davis, he just wants the North to quit. They don't have to win the war, the Southerners. That's their main battle strategy, is they just need the North to give up. And it's arguable, but there are times, especially during presidential election cycles, because there's still presidential elections during the Civil War, they want Lincoln to lose, and they want someone else to come in who is going to make some kind of deal with the South to let them go. So that is the strategy of the South and Jefferson Davis. Wrapping up now, understanding the content. I don't know. I don't want to say every question, but almost every question will have something about slavery. Look at all the past papers. Don't take my word for it. It is a huge part of this option is the issue of slavery and the run-up to the Civil War. So slavery compromises, please know them inside out to prepare for your exam. Know the impact of Bleeding Kansas, popular sovereignty. Know the term border ruffians. So these are the pro-slavery people from Missouri that move over into Kansas to try to set up another slave state. Know how this was a huge issue, and it was a foreshadowing of the Civil War. Lincoln and the Republicans. Know the term radical Republicans. So the radical Republicans are the ones that are going to, as we'll see in probably the next video, what's going to happen after the Civil War. So they're going to add new amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to grant former slaves rights. But the Republicans are split between moderates and these so-called radical Republicans. One from Pennsylvania named Thaddeus Stevens. Let me give you a movie recommendation. The Steven Spielberg movie Lincoln, with Daniel Day-Lewis as Lincoln and Tommy Lee Jones as Thaddeus Stevens. So those are some great performances by those two great actors, and definitely summertime movie watch to get you ready for your U.S. option for history.